First, there is four major buckets, and this is oversimplifying a little bit, but once you get this, you'll really understand how this begins to look. First is user licensing. So I start with user licensing because it's kind of the anchor point for a lot of the other pieces. And actually, there's a lot of user licensing you buy now that encapsulate other licenses. So these days we call this the Entra ID, right? And you're used to using terms like Azure or Active Directory, depending on how you're managing the licenses, right? But your Entra ID is your identifier within the Microsoft ecosystem. We use this to authenticate. We use this to tie permissions, like what are your email permissions and access permissions, and then of course file storage as well. So your user license, we call that your Entra ID. That's the current language for it. And I do just want folks to know that this is sort of the anchor point for a lot of licensing these days is really based on user licensing. And so let's jump over because a lot of times people start the conversation about licensing with Office, right? People will call us and say, we want 365 licenses or we want Microsoft licenses. And what they usually mean is they want Office licensing. And so I do want to kind of mention this. I already said we see a lot of licensing based on user licensing. And one of the things that we did tell folks when we were marketing for this webinar is there's like a dozen ways to buy Microsoft Office licenses, right? So even just within the device ecosystem, you can buy it perpetual or annual. That's really kind of a device licensing model, right? Most user licensing really is annual, of course. And you can still get Microsoft Office for free if you're a school. I want to make sure you hear that from me. And this is what's typically called an O365 A1. And so this is still available for schools, but again, it's online only. And it's actually a user license, by the way. You'll notice that whenever you see 365, they were typically talking about user licensing. And then there's other options like standard versus pro. There's the bigger Office packages. And again, I'm not trying to confuse you as much as just help you to understand most Office licensing is bought on a user basis, but there are these other options. And there are even still the user free Office licenses available to schools or districts, but it's online apps only, which not everybody prefers, right? We like the desktop app option. And then there's different ways to pay for these licenses. And then there's great ways to bundle these licenses under a big user licenses. And that's why we usually sell them that way. But a lot of times when people say, I want, 365 or, they're talking about Office licensing. This is actually Alex's area of specialties, right? Is operating systems and Windows devices, right? So when you're thinking of getting your Windows devices, whether it's a Surface, laptop, desktop, whatever it is, you got to think about the operating system on the device, right? And so Windows 10 is going end of life. Alex, I think you and I were just talking about that the other day. It's going to happen kind of late 2025, but it is going to happen. So can your devices upgrade? If you don't know how to check that, let us tell you how to check that within the system. It's not hard to do. And then we can talk to you about how to get Windows 11 devices. And I'll come back to this in just a second. The last bucket, and I know I'm just flying through this, but I do want you to kind of get a picture of the buckets, is really security and management, right? And so the two main products we often talk about for schools when we talk about security management would be Endpoint Defender. And there's variations of Endpoint Defender. There's levels of it, right? Depending on how secure you need those endpoints to be. And then there's Intune, which is Microsoft's mobile device management tool, right? But think about that as they both belong within the security and management category, right, for Microsoft licensing. So now all of a sudden you understand the four major buckets of Microsoft licensing. You can begin to even understand more complicated topics like, let's say, Autopilot, right? You've heard of Autopilot before, and you're like, what does Autopilot do? Autopilot is a management tool that you use to manage your operating system images, right? With your apps and your settings and your unique image you want to go. So Autopilot kind of lives in both of these buckets, right? Which is kind of fun. And so Autopilot is a security license, but it is used to manage your endpoint devices, right? And what's the image on the endpoint device? Let's even go as far as talking about Copilot AI, right? What is Copilot AI? That is obviously Microsoft's AI tool. Now, if you have a Microsoft license, you can already use Copilot within the Edge browser, right? And this is how most AI or the language learning models function is they function by combing the web for information. And if you have any kind of Microsoft licensing active, just about any within the district currently, your teachers or your administrators or staff and maybe even students can go to the Edge browser, top right-hand corner, and activate Copilot and use it on the web. But if you buy Copilot for your staff or for your teachers, it is a user license that is used within the user ecosystem, right? You pay for it per user. Now you can search your own file storage. You can search your own emails for information or trends or, which of my quizzes or questions do the students never seem to get right? You can look through your own information and then you also use Copilot within Office, right? So you use Copilot within Word, within PowerPoint, within the various Office apps to enhance your lesson plan building, things like that. So even something like Copilot is a lot easier to understand when you understand the 4 buckets of Microsoft licensing, because again, it is a user license. You use it within your user ecosystem, and then you use it within the Office apps ecosystem as well. So we often talk about O365 or M365 licenses. Now, the reason why, if you come to us and ask us for Microsoft licensing, well, we will often direct you to one of these 2 SKUs. And there is also A5. We already talked about the A1, the O365 A1. That's the freebie, online apps only, a little limited. But the O365 A3, well, that covers your user licensing and your Office licensing, right? So why do we oftentimes direct people towards an O365 if they have really limited Microsoft usage, but they still need all the user licensing tools and all the Office tools? That's an O365 A3. But if you're, really significantly have a large Microsoft deployment within the school or district, we'll often push you towards the M365 because it not only gets you everything we described here, but it also gets you all of these tools down here, right? So an M365 A3, a lot of times when you come to us and you say, I want some Microsoft licensing, we'll start with one of these 2 because it gets you all of the above the line and below the line tools that are described here. It also gets you Endpoint Defender and Intune, and it also gets you the ability to upgrade or downgrade your Microsoft licenses. This is why we often recommend the M365 A3 is because it's kind of the all-in-one solution. It gives you all 4 of these buckets within your educational entity, and it's pretty reasonably priced. If you tried to buy all of these things individually a la carte, you'd spend way more money than getting it all together, right? And this is what we mean when we say there's so many different ways to buy Microsoft Office. You can just buy it outright per user, per device, perpetual annual, whatever else, or you can buy it within the bundled SKU ecosystem here, right? So once you grasp the 4 major buckets of Microsoft licensing, it makes these conversations so much easier with your providers or folks like us, even when you want to go buy licensing.